On January 31st, 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm II signed an order that Imperial Germany would return to a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare beginning the next day. That decision was predicated upon a memorandum by Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, which asserted that if the U-boats could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, then Britain would be forced to sue for peace within 6 months. German High Command knew that this policy would draw America into the war, but they considered it an acceptable risk, assuming that they could defeat Britain before America could effectively mobilize. In many ways, the deciding campaign of the First World War was not the German spring offensives of 1918 or the Allied 100 Days Offensive later that year, but rather whether in 1917 the German U-boats could meet that goal. And the tactic that would defeat those U-boats was the convoy system. There are many stories to tell about the battles between the navies of the Entente powers and the U-boats of the Imperial German Navy. But one particular convoy, in October of 1917, deserves to be remembered. In his 2005 book, The Great War and Imperial History, historian John Morrow of the University of Georgia calculated that the Imperial German Navy had 105 submarines ready for action the day they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the fleet construction guaranteed that at least 120 would be available for the rest of 1917, even accounting for losses. U.S. Rear Admiral William Sims, who commanded all U.S. naval forces in Europe during the Great War, wrote in his 1920 book, The Victory at Sea, "The Allied navies, while they controlled the surface of the water, did not control the subsurface, which at that time was practically at the disposition of the Germans." At first, the German strategy was a success, as the Imperial War Museum notes. The new U-boat blockade nearly succeeded. Between February and April 1917, U-boats sank more than 500 merchant ships. In the second half of April, an average of 13 ships were sunk each day. The U-boats sank a total of 368,521 tons of Allied shipping in January. In February, the number jumped to over 540,000, and the goal of 600,000 was nearly met in March. A convoy system using surface warships to escort merchant vessels seems to be common sense, but actually faced wide opposition from both the Royal Navy and merchant captains. The system was complex, necessarily slowed supply, stretched naval assets, and some argued was simply beyond the technical capabilities of merchant ships and crews. Rear Admiral Sims noted that many naval officers opposed the introduction of a convoy system because its introduction would mean immediately cutting down the tonnage 15 or 20%, because of the time which would be consumed in assembling the ships and awaiting escorts, and in the slower average speed which they could make. The alternative of arming merchant vessels found support in both the Royal Navy and some of the leadership of their new allies in the United States Navy. Many merchant captains preferred taking their chances alone. But April was a turning point, when the U-boat sank over 860,000 tons of shipping in a single month. Grain reserves in the United Kingdom dropped to just 6 weeks. Britain was on the verge of starvation. The first revival of the convoy system began with cross-channel traffic in February, and a convoy system was being regularly used between Britain and Norway by April. A regular use of the convoy system for transatlantic trade began in May. The convoy system immediately reduced merchant ship losses, but the Battle of the Atlantic was still a harrowing experience for the merchant crews, their military escorts, and the U-boats that hunted them. Every convoy could be its own story. One convoy from the African port of Dakar, October 7th, 1917, represented some of the challenges of the system. Owing to the rage limits of most U-boats at the time, the greatest risk was within 3 days of Britain, so the convoy would usually proceed with a single escort to the point of danger, when it would be joined by an escort of destroyers for the rest of the trip. Destroyers of the U.S. Navy had arrived in what was then called Queenstown, Ireland, in May, and were regularly included in convoy escorts by midsummer. There were multiple convoy routes used by the Allies during the war. Trade across the North Atlantic might come from Nova Scotia or Hampton Roads, Virginia, to the UK. Convoys from the Mediterranean were often formed at Gibraltar. Convoys from the South Atlantic and Caribbean were frequently formed at French colonies in Africa. One of the ports where convoys was formed was Dakar, Senegal, at the time a major French colonial port. Shipping from South America and British and French African colonies would come to Dakar and would be formed into convoys to proceed to the UK. Dakar convoys were usually so-called slow convoys, made up of ships able to average only around 9 knots. The convoys can comprise as much as 50 ships, although they were often smaller. A convoy of some 20 ships departed Dakar on October 7th, headed for ports in the United Kingdom. The deep ocean part of the journey would be escorted by HMS Orama. Orama had been launched as RMS, or Royal Mail Ship Orama, in 1911. Sailing for the Orient Line, the liner of 19,927 gross registered tons was, at the time, the largest sailing between Great Britain and Australia. The ship used so-called combination machinery, that is, a combination of triple expansion steam engines and a low-powered steam turbine that was typical of the period. She could make 18 knots. Orama operated between the ports of Tilbury and Brisbane, but with the outbreak of war in September 1914, was called into service in the Royal Navy as an armed merchant cruiser and mounted with 8 6-inch Mark VII naval guns. Orama participated in naval patrols in the Atlantic and Pacific, hunting enemy commercial vessels and U-boats, and in March 1915, along with other Royal Navy ships, participated in a brief battle against the German light cruiser Dresden. In August 1917, Orama escorted a convoy of ships from Halifax, and then, at the end of September, proceeded south to escort a convoy from Dakar. The convoy left Dakar on October 7th, and Orama's logs from the trip have been preserved. The logs represent the general difficulties of keeping together ships of different capabilities and crews. The log shows convoy ships frequently falling out of line. At least one, SS Ham, was forced to abandon the convoy due to boiler issues. Sims noted that ships falling behind were a constant issue for the convoys, making what he called tempting bait for the submarines. The merchant captains, themselves often unhappy with the convoy system, were often part of the problem, and Sims contends, at this time certain of the merchant captains manifest an incurable obstinacy. They affected to regard the U-boats with contempt, and insisted rather on taking chances, instead of playing the game. Orama recorded it leaving several times to inspect ships that had been sighted, always ready to interdict enemy commerce. Still, the Orama's log noted mostly routine issues and no encounter with the dreaded U-boats, when on September 19th they were met with their escort of 10 destroyers just west of the Bay of Biscay. That day would prove to be exciting for the convoy. At 8:50 in the morning, the escort Tucker-class destroyer USS Cunningham received a distress call. An unescorted American vessel, the 4,920-ton steamer J.L. Luckenbach, was being shelled by a German U-boat. The Cunningham was under the command of Lieutenant Commander Alfred Wilkinson Johnson, who was in overall command of the escorts. The Luckenbach was some 90 miles ahead of the convoy, and Johnson dispatched the O'Brien-class destroyer USS Nicholson to assist. Sims wrote that a great deal of the destroyer's duty was to rescue merchantmen that were being attacked by submarines. The Luckenbach incident was indicative of the tactics regarding U-boats of the era. While the common conception might be that the primary weapon of the submarines was the torpedo, in fact, Sims notes, torpedoes are complicated and expensive mechanisms. Each one cost about $8,000, and the average U-boat carried only from 8 to 12. It was therefore necessary to husband these precious weapons, to use them only when the chances most favored success. Thus, the submarines, in this case the Type 57 U-boat U-62, used their deck weapons whenever possible. Sims continues, had the submarine used its torpedo upon this vessel, it probably would have disposed of it summarily. But it was the part of wisdom for the submarine to economize in these weapons because they were so expensive and so comparatively scarce, and to use its guns whenever the opportunity offered. Unknown to Sims, it was later determined that the U-62 had been raiding and had only a single torpedo left. But, by a March 13 executive order of the President, U.S. merchant ships had been armed, and the Luckenbach mounted guns, both fore and aft. The New York Times reported that at 7:30 a.m. the Luckenbach reported a steamer abeam. Both the Luckenbach's guns were trained on the vessel. The guard commander went aloft to obtain a better view. When he was halfway up the vessel, now discovered to be a submarine, opened fire. The Luckenbach fought back bravely. The Times reported that the freighter fired 202 rounds from its guns at the submarine. But, Sims notes, the Luckenbach was armed, but the fact that the submarine's guns easily outranged hers made her armament useless. Thus all the German had to do in this case was to keep away at a safe distance and bombard the merchantmen. Still, the freighter's armaments forced the U-boat to attack from range, reducing the effectiveness of their fire. Sims reported the radio communication between Luckenbach and the convoy. At 9:30, the captain of the Luckenbach reported that he was maneuvering around. The Times reported that the captain was told to put the stern at the submarine. This would have made the smallest possible target while giving the stern gun the best field to fire. At 9:35, the freighter radioed, "How far away are you?" The situation was dire. The Times reported that early in the battle, a shot from the submarine landed on the deck forward of the port side and exploded in the gun crew's quarters, starting a fire which partially destroyed the quarters and burned the effects of the gun crew. The same shot burst the fire main. The commander of the Naval Armed Guard Detachment reported that pieces of shot were falling all around the deck. At 9:40, the Luckenbach radioed again, saying that they had thrown their code books overboard, a sign that the ship was in danger of capture. The ship asked the destroyer, "How soon will you arrive?" Nicholson's answer was 2 hours. Knowing that the ship was unlikely to survive 2 hours of shelling, Luckenbach responded, "Look for boats. They are shelling us." The captain assumed that after 2 hours, all that would be left was lifeboats. Still, the Nicholson radioed, "Do not surrender," and Luckenbach bravely radioed back, "Never." A shot from the submarine landed near the stern and disabled the Luckenbach's aft gun. Commander of the armed guard said, "The men stationed at the gun never flinched. When the after gun was put out of commission, the after pointers came to the forward gun and relieved one another." The ship was slowly taking damage. It hit near the waterline and destroyed most of the ship's fresh water supply. Another struck the petty officer's mess room and put the ash hoist out of commission, injuring 2 crewmen. A shot went through the bridge, going through the weather screen but landing in the cargo before exploding. Still, the ship had endured a great deal of fire. The U-boat had been shelling them for nearly 3 hours. The guns were unable to damage the U-boat, but had forced it to attack from range, and Sims noted, evidently, the marksmanship was poor. At 11 o'clock, the lookouts reported smoke on the horizon. It was the Nicholson. The Luckenbach turned towards the smoke, but shortly after a shell struck the engine room, injuring the first and third engineer and disabling the engine. The Luckenbach was at the U-boat's mercy, but Nicholson was charging, and the U-boat fled. Sims wrote, "The submarine was always heroic enough when it came to shelling defenseless merchantmen, but the appearance of a destroyer anywhere in her neighborhood made her resort to one secure road to safety, diving for protection." The Nicholson immediately trained her guns on the U-boat, which on the second shot disappeared under the water. The Times noted that the Luckenbach had fired its first shot at 7:40 in the morning and fired its last shot at 11:40. Amazingly, the merchant vessel had endured 4 hours of being attacked by the U-boat. The Nicholson sent crew to assist in repairs and putting out fires. The Luckenbach was repaired in about 2.5 hours and returned with the Nicholson to join the convoy. Because the U-boat had been kept at bay, the Armed Guard commander reported, at least 225 rounds were fired by the submarine, out of which there were only 9 clean hits. It seemed an almost miraculous survival, but the convoy had not seen the last of SMU 62. At 17:55 hours, a torpedo struck the Orama, just behind number 3 hold. Sims wrote, "It was now late in the afternoon. The sea had quieted down. The whole atmosphere was one of peace. There was not the slightest sign or suggestion of a hostile ship. The Orama had taken up her position as leading ship in the second column. Without the slightest warning, a terrific explosion now took place on her starboard bow. The U-62 had infiltrated the convoy and used its last precious torpedo to strike the Orama. This was always a risk, but the advantage of a convoy was that if a U-boat attacked, it would be immediately vulnerable to the convoy's escorts. In this case, USS Cunningham." Sims wrote, "The Cunningham reined for full speed and dashed for the location of the submarine. Her officers and men now saw more than the periscope. They saw the vessel itself. The water was very clear, and as the Cunningham circled around the Orama, her officers and men sighted a green, shining, cigar-shaped thing under the water, not far from the starboard side. As she sped by, the destroyer dropped a depth charge almost directly on top of the object. After the waters had quieted down, pieces of debris were seen floating up to the surface. Boards, spars, and other miscellaneous wreckage, evidently scraps of the damaged deck of a submarine." The escorts worked for nearly 5 hours to try to save the stricken Orama, but in the end it proved to be futile. She slipped beneath the waves bow first, around 2100 hours. Her crew were successfully evacuated, but 5 later died of injuries due to the attack. While the Cunningham's attempt to ram the U-boat failed, the crew had every reason to think that they had sunk her with their depth charge. But Admiral Sims notes that one of the things that made the task of the destroyer so thankless was that it was only in the rarest of cases that they could prove they had actually sunk the submarine. And in this case, they hadn't. SMU 62 survived the war, eventually sinking 46 vessels representing more than 120,000 tons, including 2 warships. Upon the signing of the armistice, the Allies insisted that the hated U-boats all be surrendered and broken up. While there were a few injuries, there were no deaths aboard the J.L. Luckenbach, which made it safely to its destination at the port of Le Havre, France. The attack on the ship was somewhat ironic. The ship that had been attacked by a German U-boat had initially been built for a German line, North German Lloyd, as the SS Saale. The ship had burned and sunk in the Great Hoboken Docks fire of 1900. Had been salvaged, refloated, and turned into a cargo vessel. After the U-boat attack, the Nicholson had helped to extinguish a fire in the ship's cargo, burning bales of cotton. A fire in a bale of cotton had started the Hoboken fire. Rear Admiral Sims contends that it was the Grand Fleet that kept the German Imperial Navy's surface fleet at bay so that the destroyers could do their job. But in the end, the first Battle of the Atlantic was fought as hundreds of small ship actions between escorts, U-boats, and merchant vessels across a vast ocean, each one a story that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.